Good morning. First thing I want to do is tell you how much I appreciate being asked to talk to this congregation on this advisory board Sunday. As I look back over almost 77 years, I realize how incredibly fortunate and blessed I've been in the people I've met and gotten to know and worked with over the decades. And the Salvation Army is just the most recent example. The good Lord knew I would need good influences in my life, and He has certainly been persistent about it. In addition to my wife, who's right out there, I'm thinking of a visit I had with Billy Graham. I'm thinking of a priest I knew in Vietnam, Father Vincent Capodanno, who was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. He was a true man of God. I'm thinking of a gentleman I sat down next to on an airplane. I wanted to read. He wanted to talk. So I put down my book, and we talked. He was a well-known evangelical author, Josh McDowell, author of Evidence That Needs a Verdict and More Than a Carpenter. There are more, all seemingly by chance, but in my opinion, not by chance. Unfortunately, many of these people are no longer with us. They've passed on to glory. One such person who had become a good friend but who left us in 2015 was another Catholic priest, Father Joe Garzone. I thought of Father Joe recently when I pulled this book, A Portrait of Jesus, off my bookshelf. The book prompted a host of memories I had of what a good teacher Father Joe had been. My wife and I often stayed with him at his home in Altamont, New York on those occasions, and he would share with us what was coming in a book series he had launched in 1983 entitled Joshua. Joshua is a contemporary story written in simple language of a carpenter and Christ-like figure who shows up in small towns and transforms people's lives through random acts of kindness and messages of peace. But Father Joe had to start his own publishing company to get his books out because the publishing houses he approached rejected his writings. However, after several years, Macmillan and later a Doubleday subsidiary saw what was going on at the grassroots level, and they bought the rights to Joshua. Eventually, Father Joe produced 10 Joshua novels. They were translated into a dozen languages and sold over 3 million copies. Its success became known among publishing executives as the Joshua phenomenon, and even a movie was made about it. Now, why do you think these books struck such a chord with their readers? Joshua and Portrait of Jesus are easy reads, as are all of Father Joe's books, but in my theologically untutored opinion, they're full of important insights that are relevant to all of us. Relevant to us first as aspiring followers of Jesus because of the significance to each of us spiritually of truly understanding Jesus' message, and because of the importance of that clearer understanding in helping us to follow his example, and relevant to us second as citizens, because today our faith as an integral and valued pillar of our society and culture is under great pressure and is perceptibly losing ground. I see numerous news articles, as I'm sure you do, that convince me more and more of the increasing and purposeful separation and alienation of our culture from its Christian heritage and foundation. Clearly, Christianity is under intense challenge, so it has become more important than ever to be aware of its essence and to comprehend what is at the heart of Christianity, because our faith is as relevant and as needed as it has ever been, if not more so. At the heart of Christianity, of course, is Jesus Christ. How he thinks is our theology, how he acts is our morality. So it's incumbent upon us to study carefully what he said and what he did, so we understand him as clearly as possible. This is one of the reasons this book appealed to me. It attempts to understand Jesus' ministry by looking at what he did and what he said, which of course is not unusual in itself. But Father Joe did it in a way that for me brings new perspectives to bear and makes Jesus more real and the life to which he calls us more attainable. Now, I'm aware that Father Joe had a bone or two to pick with a lot of people, especially the hierarchies of religions and especially of his own. His somewhat rebellious approach tended to appeal to me, but isn't it interesting that Jesus spent so much of his 3-year ministry in conflict with the religious authorities of the day. He was in constant hot water with them. And as Father Joe points out, there's still justification today for concern that in building great institutions of religion with our buildings and our forms and our traditions and our laws, we too often forget what is at the heart of our faith. We tend to forget Jesus' example. Now, granted, that may be a self-projection, but perhaps we don't adequately understand the message Jesus is trying to get across to us. And that gap between the heart of our faith and the way that our faith is often practiced or reflected and portrayed on a daily basis may well be a root cause of its diminishing influence in some quarters. Father Joe wrote that at seminary, quote, "We were taught theology and scripture and canon law and so many other courses, but no one ever taught any courses about Jesus himself as a person and the way he thought and his vision of life," unquote. And he said further, that omission continues today in the finest seminaries in the land. He said Christology was an elective. Doesn't that strike you as odd? There are thousands of books about Jesus, some excellent, some not so good, but the best ones have real insights. Just one tangent here, because I want to mention one of my favorites, and that's William Barclay's The Mind of Jesus, which my father gave to me many years ago. One of the most vivid passages in Barclay's book is a very plausible conjecture about what Jesus, as a 12-year-old child, must have experienced as he entered the temple, where hundreds of sheep and goats and doves were being sacrificed daily. And the smell and sight of great quantities of animal blood as it flowed along stone and marble channels, and of dead and dying animals and of their sounds, must have had a profound impact on the young Jesus. That description brings home to me what Father Joe emphasized, and I sometimes tend to forget, that this God we worship came to earth in human form and suffered as a human being. And whereas we can't forget that he is fully God, neither can we forget that he also was fully human. I mentioned earlier that one reason I value Joe Gazzone's book is because it forces me to think seriously about the fresh perspectives that the author offers us. For example, one of the most striking to me is this. The people who had grown up with Jesus for 30 years apparently never saw anything especially holy about him. Now, how could the Son of God live in Nazareth for 30 years and not impress people with his holiness, let alone his divinity? The best answer would seem to be that Jesus' idea of holiness was not the same as their idea of holiness. And maybe it's not the same as some of us today. The idea of holiness in those days was scrupulous observance of the law and loyalty to all traditions, customs, and forms of Jewish religious life. And these things are important. Our religious customs and habits and values are important to our families. They're important to our communities. They're even important to our country. But they are not the heart of the matter. Jesus is not described as religious anywhere in the Gospels. Father Joe said that one Gospel says he went around doing good, but I couldn't find the reference. In any case, Jesus does not seem to have been into religion as that is often understood or practiced today. What he was into was relationships. His relationship with God, his Father, and his relationship with people. Thus, the two greatest commandments. We all know them. You're to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love others as we love ourselves. Both positive, both commanding us to love. With these two commandments in mind, who do you think is most pleasing to God? Probably the person who first pays conscientious attention to his relationship with God, and who second cultivates love and compassion toward his or her fellow human beings. It's quite revealing that in the only example Jesus gives us of the Last Judgment, he does not cite the 10 Commandments or the 613 other commandments in the Torah as the basis for judgment. He gives us the parable of the sheep and the goats from Matthew 25. Too often, religious practices and experience miss the point of what worship of God really is. Jesus' example says that to a person who has truly found God, no person ever again is a stranger. Based on my reading of the Gospels, which is where I tend to focus when I read the Bible, I agree with this conclusion. However, I have to admit that I must not have fully found God yet, because I am really attached to my exclusive and fairly uninvolved life in Bel Air. I love tennis. I love golf. I enjoy reading. I enjoy boating. I even enjoy a little loafing every once in a while. Yet both intellectually, based on what I can read quite clearly, and based on what I know in my heart, with an uninvolved attitude, I'm not likely to qualify as much of a follower of Jesus Christ. Not because I'm evil or bad or don't follow the commandments, but because I have not yet been as involved as I could have been in the trials and tribulations of the myriad people out there who need help. And if the example and message and ministry of Jesus Christ say anything, they say we are to be involved in those trials and tribulations. Sometimes I think the practice of religion takes on form and tradition and robes and mitres and croziers and incense and magnificent structures and stained glass windows and elaborate doctrine, because we cannot in our own lives cope with the simple, straightforward message that Jesus brought to us. So religion becomes a substitute for picking up our cross and following him. Theoretically, a person could keep the 10 Commandments and never do one good thing for another human being. Perhaps that's why the only people whom Jesus seems to warn of God's judgment are those who have been insensitive to or who have lacked compassion for their fellow human beings. And that's why I'm truly thankful on this Advisory Board Sunday to be involved with the Salvation Army. It's not just being able to be around the good, positive, committed people who make up the Salvation Army and who so clearly love God. It's having my eyes open to the difficulties, the pain, and the struggles that people right here in Pinellas County, my neighbors, are having. I'm thankful through the Salvation Army to be given opportunities to help them. And I can see now there really is hope for me yet. Amen.